Hi, Eric here with 30x40 Design Workshop. This is the second video in my multi-part series on architectural model making. In this video, we'll discuss my favorite model making materials, and while I'd hoped to show the basic tools and a few time-saving shortcuts in this one, I'll save that for next time as we have a lot to cover with respect to materials. Material selection will be dependent for the most part on the model's purpose, as we discussed in part 1, and it's the one factor that will most directly impact the finished cost of your model, in both real dollars and in time. More luxurious materials require more care to work with and are often less forgiving than inexpensive ones. For this reason, you'll typically want to save the expensive materials for the more finished presentation quality models, or you may choose to use them strategically to highlight one particular portion of your model you want a client or jury to focus on. The most common scale model building materials, ranked roughly from least expensive to most, are number 1, paper. Ranging from inexpensive, readily sourced materials like manila folders, which are semi-rigid, easy to cut and paintable, to thicker colored cardstock, paper is great for quick studies or layering thin skin-like elements onto more finished models. Because it's inexpensive, you'll be more inclined to experiment, which in many ways is the entire point of architectural model making anyhow. Number 2, craft paper. Great for abstract site shapes, it marries well with the chipboard and other monochromatic model styles. Trace. Trace can be used for translucent surfaces, fabric, or modeling rough terrain. Mylar. I like the double-sided 5mm thickness for simulating translucent surfaces. It has more rigidity than trace and cuts nicely. Or you might try sheet acetate, which you can also sand to simulate translucent materials. And here's a tip. Don't use clear acetate for glass or windows. It's not going to achieve the look you're after. Even if you're trying to simulate clear glass, sand the backside. Glass is only really transparent at night when a building is lit from within, so sanding the backside will lend the glazing both mass and lightness and the proper perceptual effect you're looking for. Number 5, corrugated cardboard. Great for quick, loose studies. Excellent for blocking out contours or quick model bases. It can be sourced almost anywhere, and that means it's usually free. I like to tear away the facing for relief and textural variation. For a similar look but a finer grain, consider light bulb sleeves, which are particularly useful for simulating corrugated metal. Number 6, chipboard. My favorite thicknesses are 1/32 and 1/16 of an inch. It's a fantastically versatile modeling material. It cuts well, takes paint well, and although it's inexpensive, it looks perfectly acceptable next to both warm and cool color tones, both woods and grays. As such, it will probably become your default modeling material, at least early on as you're building your skill set, and it can work for anything from very rough studies to presentation quality models. I prefer the very thin gauges as they're easier to cut, dulling fewer blades, and the thin sheets bend and score easily. Cutting by hand rather than by laser, I tend to stay away from anything greater than 1/8 of an inch. And here's a chipboard micro tip. Large sheets of chip are hard to work with on your table. When you buy the sheet, spend a little time cutting it into smaller dimensions. This makes it easier to store and cut later when you're building on a smaller work surface. Number 7, XPS foam. I pay about $1 per square foot for a 2-inch thickness. Price will obviously vary depending on the thickness you need. As a carvable mass, foam is useful because one can easily achieve nonlinear, organic shapes as well as complex geometries that are difficult to construct using planar materials like chipboard. The resulting models from an architectural standpoint are usually on the more primitive end of finish quality. Rigid foam like XPS is hard to beat for model bases though, and it can be carved to achieve rock-like or other organic site textures without a lot of skill. And a micro tip here, when painting the foam for a more finished appearance, be sure to avoid solvent-based paints. Some spray paints are acceptable, but some are not. Be sure to read the label before spraying your precious model and watching it melt away. I use latex paints. Number 8, clay. An option if your work is more sculptural. Additive and subtractive massing studies are straightforward, and it's quite cheap. And number 9, a few you may not have considered before. This is a short list. There are many more, of course. 1, sandpaper. Spray paint for surfaces like walks or textured walls or manicured green roofs. 2, matchsticks, basically cheap balsa wood. 3, florist's wire, which is great for trees or adding detail or fenestration to models. Number 4, plastic zip ties. You can cut these and use them as planks for lots of detail on exterior models, fencing, different fenestration details. They're quite useful and they glue very well. 5, plaster. 6, real concrete. Be sure to get the high cement, the 5,000 PSI stuff. It really does cast like a real concrete wall. 7, Legos, of course. And number 8, wire screening, great for more organic, skin-like details or adding layers to exterior facades. I want to mention foam core here only because it seems to be the first of the higher quality material architecture students encounter in their model making careers. I honestly hate this stuff and I rarely use it for anything. Here's why. Number 1, it's unforgiving with cuts, and this is especially true for new modelers as the foam center or core dulls knives quickly, leaving many cuts jagged and terrible looking edges. Number 2, I think it just looks amateur. Number 3, corner joints need to be addressed, either mitered, which isn't easy, or rabbited with the joints taped or pinned together. This is time consuming, and I'd rather be designing things than tending to material deficiencies. And number 4, the paper facing, unless you source the archival stuff, is semi-gloss, which works to highlight dimples and other surface imperfections you'll no doubt create as you're building. As with all of this, you may have different results, so if you like foam core, by all means use it. I simply avoid it. Okay, now let's move on to a few of the higher quality materials. Number 1, museum board. Museum board's my go-to material for presentation models. 2-ply thickness is roughly 1/32 of an inch, 4-ply thickness is 1/16 of an inch. These two thicknesses should get you most of what you need. Unlike its oft-confused cousin mat board, museum board cuts like butter, and the color is consistent throughout. Mat board, by contrast, has a paper facing that's usually a different color. Museum board is brilliant to work with, and I find that models appear to glow from within, especially when using the lighter shades like cream, light gray, and white. This is an example of a material which will cost more to procure and consume more time when you're working with it. White and cream colors are least forgiving with dirty hands and fingerprints, so be sure to wash your hands regularly during construction. If you do get fingerprints on the board, use a high-quality vinyl eraser to remove it. Number 2, wood. The most commonly available modeling subtypes are balsa and basswood. Now, despite being a fairly skilled model maker myself, I've not been able to make a plain balsa model that I think looks aesthetically acceptable. For me, the unfinished wood is too open-grained and rough, and so it occupies this middle ground between tailored appearance of basswood and the unfinished nature of chipboard. Balsa is softer than basswood, and the open grain makes it more likely to split as you're cutting it. Basswood. If you're going to make an all-wood model, this is a good choice. It has a much tighter grain than balsa, and it's harder, which means it's more forgiving of a slip of the knife. It is, however, on the more costly end of the material spectrum. The nice thing about basswood is that it's available in a wide variety of shapes, planks, sticks, and sheets, so it's already in a form you can easily adapt to your model's scale. Of course, there are countless other woods too: maple, cedar, mahogany, pine, poplar. These will require woodworking tools to get them into a shape and size you can use for modeling. Once assembled, they aren't as easy to rip and tear either, so I would recommend you reserve them for more finished modeling tasks once your design work is complete. They can, however, inspire new ideas and offer a real sense for materiality in your work, so dig in if you're so inclined. Number 3, sheet cork. Cork has a thickness and an inherent texture which can be used to simulate site walls, stone, concrete, or rough paving. For site models with a lot of topography, it's a dream to cut contours from and is available in a variety of thicknesses. It's also self-healing and readily hides mistakes. The drawback is that it's quite expensive. For a cheaper alternative, you might use Model Railroader's cork roadbed. HO scale is easily sourced and has a nice overall 1/4 of an inch thickness. Lastly, number 4, acrylic and sheet plastics. When we move beyond the thin sheet plastics discussed earlier, thicker plastics, and I'm talking about 1/8 of an inch thickness and up, can be difficult to cut. If you have access to a laser cutter, acrylics cut easily there and can achieve beautiful finished effects in a model. Don't make the mistake of buying Lexan or polycarbonate, which can't be cut on a standard CO2 laser cutter, but must be mechanically cut with a CNC machine, for example. As we discussed in the previous video, for study models, you want to use readily available, non-precious, and inexpensive materials. The idea is to rip and tear, remove, reattach, destroy, and recombine. Materials you'll use will be from the list of cheaper materials: corrugated cardboard, chipboard, paper, cardstock, acetate, mylar, rigid foam, or trace. More finished models will use the upgraded materials, but often a few coats of spray paint can dress up an inexpensively rendered chipboard model quite nicely. Add a few select wood details, and that may be all that's needed to convey your idea. When considering what materials to construct your model with, remember that a model is meant to convey a design idea, so choosing a family of materials that will best communicate that idea is the primary goal. If the goal is to show a solid or grouping of solids and their proportional relationships to each other, planar materials are going to be less helpful. If the goal is to narrate spatial relationships, solid blocks would be a poor medium to use. Personally, I find the more a model seeks to render the reality of space, the more convincing and useful it is as a design tool. For this reason, I will almost exclusively use planar materials for modeling. However, for some designers, additive or subtractive modeling tasks, i.e. carving or sculpting, are an inherent part of designing large building forms or urban planning studies where structures must be studied for their former relationships to other building forms and organizational fabrics. Recall the fundamental building blocks of architecture, the elements we all have to work with as designers, begin with the point, which locates a fixed position in space. Extending a point creates a line, and by extruding that line, we have a plane. Adjoining multiple planes form three-dimensional volumes, or form. The visual properties of form are size, shape, color, texture, orientation, and position. Your model's materials account for the majority of these properties. Your skill composing and assembling them will account for the remainder. Use all of these visual properties to your advantage. Although size, shape, and orientation are inherent in any thoughtful modeler's composition, texture and color are often left out. It helps to remember that a scale model is a representation of a real-world condition. We build our structures with real materials, and thus our models should be informed by the physical reality of those materials. Concrete is heavy, rooted in the earth. Walls are thick. Openings in walls are small. Steel is light, soaring, thin. Glass is delicate, skin-like, taut, and luminous. The ground plane is textured, varied, and rarely flat, even in urban environments. Think about how we support buildings and the infrastructure below and above the street level, subways, excavations, perforations, circulation routes. The materials you select can be a source of architectural inspiration, rather than merely a means to show formal relationships. Very often, though, our architectural models are devoid of any sense of materiality. It's accepted practice for architects to present a sterilized version of reality with our models rendering them monochromatically in all white or natural wood. Yet this sterile version of architecture only helps to disassociate our vision from reality, and the fact that for architecture to exist at all, it must be constructed in 3 dimensions from real materials. I'll leave you with 12 quick material tips and tricks to inspire you. Number 1, source wood stock from a local millwork, carpentry, or metal shop. They're guaranteed to have cutoffs and often some really great finds. You might offer to remove all their scraps and sweep up in exchange. Number 2, rumple up craft paper to make abstract site topography. If you have a general sense for the flow of the landform, this is a fairly quick and easy exercise. Number 3, use parts from pre-molded plastic model kits as form-making progenitors. Often there are complex shapes to repurpose in your models, which may trigger new ideas and geometries not in your own design toolbox. Number 4, guitar string packs provide a variety of wire gauges for only a few dollars, or you might use piano wire. Number 5, contact tile, stone, wire mesh, wood window, and flooring suppliers for free material samples which you can use in your models. Number 6, source cocoa or coir doormats at IKEA and use these for green roofs. You might also consider artificial turf. Number 7, horse stall matting makes a beautiful base. Check farm supply stores for these inexpensive materials. Number 8, can't find the right material to simulate a real one? Print real material images on cardstock, colored paper, or even thin chipboard and use these for inspiration. Papers can be spray mounted to thicker materials for modeling purposes. Number 9, add texture. Use light score lines, then rip and tear away the face of chipboard to denote surface changes or circulation routes. Number 10, draw lines on chipboard, especially effective for model bases or wall surfaces textured like concrete and metal panels. Number 11, depict wall thickness. Walls always have a thickness. Concrete walls in reality are quite thick. Render these and any openings in them thicker for a professional level effect. I use thin strips of chip to simulate thickness at wall ends and surrounding openings at the jambs and heads. Number 12, consider how weathering and the elements will change the materials you model with. Corten rusts, granite fades, copper patinas. Dirt, grime, daylight, pollution, and use affects how buildings are perceived in the real world. Is there a design idea implicit in this realization that you can model? And now, it's your turn. What will you make with these raw materials? Let me know in the comments if I missed any of your favorites. In the next video, I'll show you around my studio, giving you a look at the tools I use and a few tips and tricks for using them. Thanks for watching and sharing. Cheers.